production of some lunatics. It was never going to work. There was no way you could have a carbon trading system without a massive government intervention to set a huge floor price, which the governments weren't prepared to do because they were captured by neoliberals. So we need to reprice goods and services because the markets fail time and time again. And finally, perhaps this is the most interesting one, or perhaps the one that doesn't get enough attention, is tax helps to strengthen and protect channels of political representation. When politicians are able to get their money from a single source like oil or gas and can bypass the electorate because it comes straight from an oil and gas company, they tend to dance to the tune of the oil and gas companies, not to the tunes of the electorates. But when they are obliged to listen to the electorate, because it's the electorate that pay, and therefore the electorate have an interest in how their money is used, then you're going to have a much stronger democratic representation. Which is what, of course, what the Americans understood during their war for independence. At least some of them understood that. So, having talked a bit about why tax is so important to democracy, I want to talk a little bit about what's happened in the last 40 years to undermine democracy, particularly to undermine our ability to tax. And I'd like to begin by introducing you to an extraordinary character with a crazy name called Grover Norquist. Has anyone ever heard of Grover Norquist? No, he's an American, one of those kind of... Anyway, Grover Norquist is probably one of the most extraordinary and successful revolutionaries that you've never heard of. He's a revolutionary of the right, an extreme libertarian. Strangely, he has a picture of Lenin on the back wall of his office. But he was an economic advisor to the Bush, Cheney, and subsequent Republican right. And he talked about his way of absolutely reducing the state to a minimum was captured in one phrase. He used the phrase, starve the beast. The beast was the state. Starve the beast, take away its tax revenues. And as you all know from the tax Tea Party movement, the deep anti-tax culture in America, and I think in this country, the deep anti-tax culture of the Daily Express, the Daily Mail, and the other right-wing papers, is a reflection of this idea that all public expenditure is bad, all private expenditure is good. Now, for those of you who want a very alternative view, look at Mariana Mazzucato's new book, talking about the entrepreneurial state. That's the title, the entrepreneurial state. And you'll find that most of the technologies, for example, in this phone here, don't come from private expenditure, private sector expenditure. Almost all of the key technologies behind this and the iPhone and most of the other technologies, including the web, come from state-driven expenditure because the state is prepared to take the long-term risks involved in these highly, highly innovative new technologies. But Grover's thing was all about starving the beast and rolling back the state. And it's within that climate that we need to look at what's happened in the last 40 years. First of all, Ronald Reagan led the way, but Mrs. Thatcher quickly followed by simply eliminating exchange and capital market controls. In other words, allowing capital to move across borders. As a kid, I knew that if I went on holiday, I could only take a certain amount of money out of Britain, and it was stamped into my passport how much I took, and there were very tight capital market controls imposed under the Bretton Woods settlement. But they were largely eliminated, and only a few countries in the world still use them. The IMF was very, very keen to totally eliminate them. They're changing their tune now. Alongside that, as part of trade liberalization, this is all part of the globalization project, trade tariffs and trade taxes have been significantly reduced. Now, that wasn't so important in the case of Europe and North America. It was devastating to the revenue streams of many African countries. There were some African countries where over 50% of their revenues came from trade tariffs and trade taxes. Cut them, as the IMF forced them to do in the 1980s, and their revenue stream disappeared. Suddenly they were having to borrow much more money from the World Bank and from other banks, which is precisely, of course, what the American banks and other European banks wanted. And needless to say, the IMF very quickly started to, as these borrowings increased, the IMF very quickly started to control or impose all sorts of conditionalities and control their democracy or limit their democracy. Because if you're having to borrow rather than taxing internally, your democratic decision-making is highly constrained. You don't need me to tell you there's been a massive expansion of cross-border trade and investment. You might want me to tell you a bit about what round-tripping is. Well, a huge proportion of the so-called investment, cross-border investment that the IMF and others have been boasting about in the last 30 years is not really foreign direct investment. If you start investigating a huge amount of the foreign direct investment, so-called foreign direct investment into Latin America, you find out that it's actually Brazilians who've moved their money offshore to the Cayman Islands, reinvesting it into Brazil to get all the tax breaks that are given to foreign investors. The same applies to Argentina and Colombia and Chile and Peru and most African countries. If you look at the biggest investor into China, for example, which country do you think is the biggest investor in China?
US.
Which?
The US.
The US. No, try again.
China.
Not bad. But in China, in the case of China, Mauritius is the biggest investor into India, or was. Now Singapore's taken over. In the case of China, it's the British Virgin Islands. Look at the stats. What does it tell you? It tells you actually the vast majority of that money belongs to Chinese officials who corruptly moved their money offshore and are now reinvesting back into China, getting all the tax breaks and laundering their money through it. Do come on in. Hello, hi there. Greetings. So that's what round tripping is, what I would hang up, there's something to always consider. For those who claim that the globalization project has led to a massive flow of foreign direct investment into countries that are starving for this foreign direct investment, I'm afraid they're absolutely delusional. The massive flows have been from south to north, as huge corrupt and illicit flows have flown out of Africa and Latin America into North America and into Europe. And a huge proportion of these so-called foreign direct investment flows are actually round-trip capital. India, for example, China, for example. And this raises serious questions about whether globalization has achieved anything useful whatsoever. But following on from that, what we're seeing, of course, is a huge increase in income from foreign sources. And that has enabled capital to engage in tax avoidance and tax evasion on a massive industrial scale. And I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes' time, so I won't elaborate on that. But we now entered into this era, for the last 30 years, we've been in this era where companies have been able to shift their profits out of the countries where they're making them and reallocate them to tax havens, where they don't get taxed. Which means that wealth has been accumulating in the hands of an ever-concentrating minority, an extraordinary minority, because the vast majority of world trade and investment is now dominated by fewer than 500 multinational companies and the ownership of those companies. So that's the background, and let's just continue. We discussed that one. To make matters worse, we have this situation, and I think that Britain is particularly vulnerable to this, politically, where we are on a treadmill of competing to attract investment. Now, I want to make a point about competition, because competition, language matters. I'm an economist. I don't recognize what the hell is being talked about when the Prime Minister says he wants to make Britain the most tax competitive country in the world. Have you heard this, by the way? Have you heard him say this? Now, in the case of David Cameron, who did a PPE at Oxford, it's unforgivable. He's supposed to know something about what he's talking about. I mean, he's supposed to know something about politics and economics. In the case of Ed Balls, another PPE, it is even more unforgivable. He's supposed to be a progressive. The theory of competition comes from the microeconomic theory of the firm. Firms compete one against the other on price and on quality of goods and services, and that's supposed to help us as consumers. Are we all agreed upon that? And I don't have a problem with that at all. But the idea that countries compete, you just stop and think about it for 10 seconds, is a nonsense. It's an absolute nonsense. It doesn't help bring prices down. It doesn't help to allocate resources better. It does none of those things. What it does is it leads to a situation where multinational companies are constantly chasing tax subsidies, a very different matter entirely. And that's the situation we face. And I think that rather than talk about it as tax competition, we should be using the term tax wars, in the same way that we talk about exchange rate wars, which devastated Europe in the 1930s. We should be talking about tax wars, where one company is getting countries to bid against one another to attract, to give it subsidies to invest. And the ridiculous situation we have, by the way, 2 days ago there was a conference in the Guildhall, the City of London Corporation held a conference organised by the Public Accounts Committee with Margaret Hodge and other politicians to talk about globalisation and taxation. And I went along and they were talking about all sorts of wonderful things. But Margaret Hodge, who's quite heroic in tackling